All right, it's a pleasure to be here and welcome to our afternoon session. We have two great speakers this afternoon, the first of which is Professor Emily Benfer. She is a visiting associate clinical professor of law at Columbia Law School. She's a well-known authority in the field of health justice. Prior to joining Columbia, Professor Benfer held a variety of positions at different schools. They included Yale Law School, Loyola University Chicago, and the Georgetown Law Center. In practice, Professor Benfer was a legislative lawyer in the successful efforts to pass the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act to require education assistance for homeless children and youth in Washington, D.C., and to align the Illinois definition of lead poisoning with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention standard. Professor Benfer has testified before Congress and appeared in numerous media outlets. Professor Benfer has so many other accomplishments, I really can only highlight a few. She was named a legal freedom fighter by Rocket Matter and one of Chicago's top 40 lawyers under 40 by the National Law Journal. She also was named Chicago Person of the Year in the Group Award category for her pro bono work to organize attorneys at O'Hare International Airport in response to the travel ban. She earned her LLM from Georgetown Law Center and a JD from Indiana University, Indianapolis. Our second speaker is Professor Elizabeth Ann Glass-Geltman. She is an associate professor at the Cooney School of Public Health and a lecturer of environmental science and policy at the Johns Hopkins University. She is the chair-elect of the law section of the American Public Health Association and the principal investigator and director of the Atlantic Emerging Technologies and Industrial Hygiene Training Center, a research and training center funded by the NIH SUPERFUND research program. This program focuses on environmental health risks associated with radon, PCBs, and soil vapor. Professor Geltman is the author of 17 books on environmental and natural resources law and policy. So, Professor Benfer, I now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Today I'd like to talk about what I'm calling the poison generations. And this is essentially the historical and civil rights analysis of the deliberate siting of federally assisted housing in toxic environments. Across the country, families living in federally assisted housing are facing an urgent health crisis due to inadequate federal monitoring and response to harmful historic decisions. Millions of adults and children are exposed to neurotoxins and carcinogens in their homes or on the land that they live. Since their inception, federal housing programs have not been designed with the health of residents in mind. Even laws that narrowly target health of federal housing program residents take a wait and see approach that requires physical harm occur prior to any intervention. So today I'd like to answer two questions. First, how did the development of and the continued investment in federally assisted housing with health hazards happen? And second, how can the federal government better respond to federal housing residents who have been exposed to toxins and protect future participants from harm? Uh-oh. There we go. Major housing policy reforms have traditionally grown out of a health crisis. During the 1930s, members of Congress highlighted public health as a central justification for the federal public housing program. As a part of the New Deal, the Public Works Administration built the first public housing units starting in 1934. This is one of them. But health wasn't the only factor. Race was a significant consideration in the siting of housing. These are quotes from some congressional testimony in 1937. Here's one of them. If you could keep these people within confines, put up a little Chinese wall around them and keep them all in Harlem, all in New York City or New York State, and did not have the children wandering all over the country, taking their low standards of living, their health conditions, their conditions of life along with them, you might say it is a local problem, but those things are spreading throughout our country. And again, I would say they are a shiftless race. So in response to this public outcry, in 1939, the federal government imposed the Neighborhood Composition Rule, which required that the racial composition of public housing developments reflect the racial composition of surrounding neighborhoods. So this meant that national policy was intent on rigidly maintaining residential segregation. So before the rule was invalidated in 1949, more than 170,000 units of public housing were already built. And even after invalidation of the rule, public housing, in particular family housing, continued to be largely built in communities of color. And racism played a role in the siting of these homes on or near environmental contamination. So in many cases, federally assisted housing was intentionally placed near industrial sites without consideration for the health impact. In 1965, public housing was described as a civic monument to misery, a bungling and hellish way of life, a death trap, a concentration camp. And in 1980, more than 1 million public housing units were built in highly concentrated and segregated and toxic areas of the United States. So it's no surprise that in 1966, then East Chicago Housing Authority Executive Director Benjamin Lesniak stated that there were limited siting options for public housing in East Chicago. And as a result, developments would either require the demolition of current buildings or be placed in vacant areas surrounded by industries and undesirable residential areas. Lesniak also stated that the majority of tenants would be people of color, and that the East Chicago Housing Authority would build public housing in areas that are predominantly Black and or Latinx, a position consistent with the federal government's directives of placing public housing sites for racial and ethnic minorities in majority minority communities. In 1970, the East Chicago Housing Authority received a $13.4 million grant from HUD to build the complex. From the time the housing complex was built, it was on the site of 3 former lead smelters, including the Anaconda White Lead, Eagle Pitcher, and US Smelter and Refinery, which was actually active until the 1990s. Government officials knew of the severe health risk caused by exposure to lead and arsenic that was the runoff of these industry sites, and yet the residents remained unaware of the source of lead poisoning among children, the loss of pregnancies among mothers, and cancer among adults. Between 1985 and 1986, lead testing revealed that children had elevated blood lead levels. In response, EPA tested and found that the levels of lead in the dirt ranged from 100 parts per million to 11,000 parts per million. By the 1990s, more than 40% of children tested had elevated blood lead levels. And then in 1996, East Chicago Housing Authority received a $1.5 million modernization grant to keep the complex open in the same hazardous location. In 2008, EPA finally evaluated the site under the hazard ranking system and referred the area to the national priority list. In 2009, the Calumet neighborhood on which this is, USS lead Superfund site was finally declared. After decades of environmental contamination and neglect, the state, the federal authorities, and the EPA reported to the city of East Chicago that it had found lead levels as high as 91,100 parts per million, which is 228 times the EPA's maximum permitted lead level. Yet the families still were not informed, and families were continuing to move into the site. It bears repeating, families were not notified until August of 2016, and their notification consisted of a 60-day deadline to relocate because they were going to demolish the site. For more than 40 years, government officials stood by as thousands of infants, children, and adults resided in the West Calumet Public Housing Complex in East Chicago, Indiana, where they were chronically exposed to neurotoxins and carcinogens. Meanwhile, generations of families had been exposed to toxic levels of lead and arsenic and suffered permanent disability, early life mortality, and over the past 5 decades. And race may play a role in the response to these disasters as well. In 2016, former Indiana Governor Mike Pence refused to provide disaster relief necessary to relocate the East Chicago families to safety. But he did not hesitate to provide similar assistance to Greentown, Indiana, when the lead content of the water was only slightly elevated, and Greentown's population is 97% white. There's also evidence that racial disparity exists in the Superfund designation process. Communities that have a larger minority population are significantly less likely to be listed as a Superfund site, even though the sites are just as hazardous as those that do make the list. And it's persisted in recent years. Between 1994 to the mid-2000s, if a community had a 10% or more minority population, it lowered the chance of being listed on the national priority list by 7%. If there was a 10% or higher Native American population, it decreased the chances of being listed by 80%. And low-income communities decreased by 31%. Therefore, not only are low-income communities and communities with a higher proportion of people of color disproportionately exposed to environmental contamination, they are also less likely to be listed as a Superfund site that triggers the release of funding and significant attention that they require. West Calumet and the East Chicago Housing Authority were no exception. It was home to 30,000 individuals and children, 87% of whom were Black, 11% Latino or Hispanic, 2% non-Hispanic white, and 18% identified as being a person with disability. Since then, it has become clear that East Chicago represents an urgent public health and environmental justice issue that's affecting individuals and families across the country in federally assisted housing. Indeed, 70% of hazardous waste sites officially listed on the national priority list under CERCLA or Superfund are located within 1 mile of federally assisted housing across the country. In fact, the federal government has invested billions of dollars in the construction and preservation of affordable housing programs, but has done little to nothing to protect those residents from these health-harming environments, inside and outside of their homes. And they have not informed any of the residents of their findings that their homes are within 1 mile of Superfund sites. The concentration of tenant-based rental assistance programs is also a source of lead poisoning among federally assisted housing tenants. This is a map of communities of color that are highly segregated in census tracts with high poverty rates, making them more susceptible to lead poisoning. And if you overlay this map with the historic redlining maps, you will see that they are largely identical. With the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, I engaged in mapping to better understand the issue of 2.5 million households with 4 million children who are at risk of lead poisoning in federally assisted housing. And we learned that the highest rates of lead poisoning in the Housing Choice Voucher Program are clustered in low-income neighborhoods that are identical to the historic redlining maps that largely segregated areas into census tracts with high poverty rates. I estimate that 90,416 children have lead poisoning in the Housing Choice Voucher Program annually, and each year this costs us $1.2 billion. The health impacts for residents living with toxic exposure, such as lead and arsenic, are substantial, irreversible, and life-altering. Lead poisoning causes irreversible neurological harm, and it results in numerous and severe morbidities, such as reduced IQ, permanent brain damage, significant biological and neurological damage that affect cognition, behavior, bodily function, growth, development, and exposure to arsenic, a heavy metal, can cause skin, lung, bladder, liver, or kidney cancer. Lead poisoning affects minorities at a disproportionate rate. African American children are 3 times as likely to develop lead poisoning, and Hispanic children 2 times as likely as their Caucasian peers. A child who is lead poisoned is 7 times more likely to drop out of school and 6 times more likely to enter the criminal justice system. So you can see how this is compounding all of the risks and harms to children who are living in federally assisted housing. For all of these reasons, and those contained in over 6,000 studies, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Centers for Disease Control, among others, all agree no amount of lead in the blood is safe, and we require a wide margin of safety. Again, to this day, HUD and EPA have yet to inform federally assisted housing tenants of their proximity to these dangerous toxins and Superfund sites. So in spite of the complex web of federal environmental laws that are ostensibly in place to prevent families from experiencing unhealthy levels of environmental contamination, there remains a startling lack of interagency coordination and communication between the federal agencies that are responsible for these programs. And this puts federally assisted housing tenants at risk. I think that these shortcomings fall into 5 categories. First, the failure to notify families of environmental contamination. Second, the failure to provide families with real choice as to where they live, or to have autonomy over decision-making for their family's health. Failure to include environmental health issues in housing inspections before a child or an individual is harmed, and the approval of new construction, ignoring the environmental contamination nearby. And finally, failure to monitor existing housing that is not undergoing significant reinvestment of federal housing funds. A patchwork of housing and environmental laws govern federal agencies' response to these contaminants. These include the United States Housing Act, the CERCLA, National Environmental Policy Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and Executive Order 12898. And in particular, 12898 directs agencies to improve enforcement of the health and environmental laws in minority and low-income communities, public participation, and research relevant to minority and low-income communities. If it was being followed, a lot of these harms could have been identified earlier. Title VI, I'd like to draw your attention to that, of the Civil Rights Act, is a potentially potent tool for remedying environmental injustice because this law prohibits recipients of federal funds from discriminating on the basis of race, color, or national origin, which is clearly happening in federally assisted housing. In fact, in 2016, the US Commission on Civil Rights issued a report where it stated, if enforced vigorously, Title VI can be a powerful tool for EPA to address environmental justice and remediate discrimination. However, the commission concluded that, quote, EPA does not take action when faced with environmental justice concerns until forced to do so. And when they do act, they make easy choices and outsource environmental justice responsibilities onto others. Now in East Chicago, at the West Calumet housing complex, the Title VI claim actually resulted in additional relocation assistance for tenants. We were able to successfully use that law and combined with the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure that families would receive reasonable accommodations in the form of housing without lead hazards when that place was demolished. But ultimately, no penalties, no compliance audits, varying approaches to lead inspections, all of these are a failure to fulfill the federal duty to provide safe and decent housing and to further environmental justice and to protect against discrimination. So what are we to do? Well, going forward, HUD and EPA must take significant actions to protect residents of federally assisted housing. All of the recommendations that you see on this screen, we go into great detail in our research and writing about this and in a forthcoming report. But I think there are 3 overarching recommendations that all of these require. The first is policymakers must make every effort to develop and implement primary prevention policies. That means find the harm and address it before people are exposed. We must address the conditions that are disproportionately affecting these low-income communities. This is the most reliable and cost-effective measure to protect children and individuals from exposure to hazards, and it has to be the priority. Second, we have to have a presumption of adverse health effects when populations are exposed to multiple hazards and multiple sources of harm. And there must be community-based participation. This is a critical tool in reducing environmental hazards in affected communities, and it is one that is often promoted by the public health field and is tried and true in this type of response. and it's not happening today. Lastly, there must be a financial commitment, a real financial commitment to addressing these issues, to building housing that is truly safe and decent, and that will protect the health of families as opposed to place them in additional harm. Across the country, families living in federally assisted housing are facing an urgent health crisis. Millions of adults and children across generations have been and continue to this day to be exposed to neurotoxins and carcinogens in their homes or on the land that they live. Urgent action is necessary to protect these residents from this unconscionable injustice. Thank you very much.
You are still muted, Elizabeth.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, okay, good. So thank you. That actually was a really, really nice introduction and an amazing case study for what I want to talk about globally today. So my topic is environmental just code, zip code, and deregulation. And I want to explain how place-based environmental exposures impact health and talk a little bit about what we need to do about it. So this here are two illustrations. One on the map is of the DC subway. It's actually one of my favorite illustrations of environmental justice and environmental inequities. And what it shows is the decrease in life expectancy via subway stop in the Washington, DC metro area subway. And you can see that there's a very big disparity between the neighborhoods in Anacostia and in portions of Maryland where it is 78 years old, and upper Montgomery County where the life expectancy is 84 years old. And these are areas that are not very far apart in terms of geography, but are light years apart in terms of life expectancy. The other graphic is showing the similar thing in California of zip codes, and that's looking at the difference between one zip code where it's 73 years life expectancy and another 88. And again, these are a mile apart. It works out very, very nicely that I'm using a Chicago map to illustrate in comparison to what our prior speaker was talking about in terms of differences in neighborhoods, and the disparities in neighborhoods by subway stop in Cook County out in Chicago is equally shocking in terms of areas of differences. And in the public health world, the fact that zip code is the most important predictor of health is not particularly exciting or interesting. It's something we've known about and talked about for a very, very long time. In the legal world, it hasn't been doing as much. So I really wanted to bring these illustrations in terms of what we're going on. The important thing to understand when people usually talk about zip code as a predictor of health is that it's very, very often used as a proxy for things like race and a proxy thing for socioeconomic status. And that's absolutely positively true. But in addition to being a proxy for that, what it isn't a proxy for, what it actually is environment. And what you're seeing is that the environment in areas fairly close together are very, very different, and that they have very, very different impacts. And the speaker before talked really, really nicely, giving an illustration of lead and SUPERFUND exposures in public housing, but it goes well beyond that. It's not just a public housing problem, and the disparities go into many, many different health effects. So I want to show you here, this is data coming from the CDC that's been accumulated by the insurance industry. And what they're looking at for insurance purposes is the leading causes of death in the United States. And what you'll notice when you look at it is that the top 5 causes of death in the United States are things that have shown many, many data that they have important environmental and occupational implications. So heart disease and cardiovascular disease is closely associated with problems of air pollution. And people who are living in areas with greater amounts of air pollution, things like traffic and living near highways and other things, are prone to cardiovascular disease because these types of pollutants, particulates, are known to go into the cardiovascular system, to be inhaled very deeply in the lungs and cause heart attacks and other things. Cancer has long been known to be a adverse impact from living associated with particularly toxic waste and hazardous waste sites. The original site, Love Canal, the original Superfund site and nationally priority sites, became of interest because of concerns about both cancer and endocrine disruption issues. So we've long been looking at Superfund cleanups in conjunction with cancer and other things. Unintentional injuries include injuries on the job, as well as things like overdose and suicides. The number one cause of injury on the jobs are still construction crushes and falling, which are things that are regulated by OSHA and have been in, I'm going to talk about before, under attack in terms of lack of regulations. Respiratory diseases, things like asthma, closely associated with air pollution, other types of issues. So what you're looking at is when you're talking about environmental pollution, environmental exposures, and adverse environmental exposures in different zip codes, you're seeing that those are things that we know for a fact are impacting health and are impacting life expectancy. So I want to talk for a minute about what I call the environmental safety regulation paradox. And the paradox here is that in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a ground surge of interest in environmental protection. And in the 1970s, we saw a whole slew of environmental legislation going through that was passed almost unanimously. So the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, which was signed into law, ironically, by President Richard M. Nixon, a Republican, was signed into law by a Republican president and enacted almost unanimously. In terms of consensus. And everybody, Republicans, Democrats, everybody was saying, yes, we want to make sure that our air is clean and breathable, that our waters are fishable and swimmable, and that we can drink the water. And that was a fundamental American value, regardless of race. That's something that has said, and this is Pew Research showing that when people think environmental regulations are protective versus red tape, there is a very, very real difference in terms of people who, from a bipartisan basis. Not news, but something important to understand when we think about environmental regulation, because the fundamental paradox is, do we look at these regulations as more protective of health or more red tape? Because they are in fact both. A lot of the regulations are cumbersome. They are difficult to comply with. They do, in fact, restrict the economy, and people who are freed of the regulations of protecting the environment, protecting workers, do in fact make more money. The reason we put them into place is because as a country, we thought that there had to be balance between freedom to make money and requirements to protect your own workers, your neighbors, and people in the environment. So when the Trump administration came into being, one of the promises that the administration said is that they wanted to deregulate. And the promise that Trump made was, he said that for every regulation that was promulgated, we would deregulate and two regulations. As soon as he came into office, President Trump issued Executive Order 13771, which was quickly followed by Executive Order 13777. And what both of those orders do is they mandated regulatory reform. So just like we talked earlier in the day about the mandate by President Clinton to consider environmental justice in federal decision-making, this mandated deregulation as the policy of the land. What we've seen in terms of the promise was 2 deregulatory efforts for every 1 regulatory effort. In fact, the deregulation has come at an astonishing pace. So in 2017, it was 22 deregulations to 1 regulation. In 2018, the ratio was 12 deregulations to every 1. And in 2019, it was 4.3. So while it was slowing down in terms of total deregulation, when you look at it area by area and agency by agency, the story becomes different. The reaction to whether this is too much or too little also has skewed very, very much along political lines. So the Democratic people, or people who are Democratic leaning, are really concerned that there isn't enough environmental protection, whereas the Republicans and those Republican leanings have been very, very pleased with the deregulatory efforts and have been looking at as better in terms of enhancing the economy. These are the facts, and this is the number of what's going on. So this data comes from OMB, from OIRA, who has been collecting the deregulatory and issuing a report annually. And what you'll see here is a graph of all the agencies and what they've reported as their deregulatory and their regulatory actions by year. It's from 2017 to 2019. The green and blue are the deregulatory efforts. The orange, red, and purple are the regulatory efforts. So your immediate thing that you know just when you look at it is lots of more deregulation than you see regulation. When you separate out the agencies that did absolutely, had no effect, regulatory otherwise, what you see when you look closer is that the agencies that have had the most deregulations are the ones that are dealing with health and the environment. So when you look here at USDA, when you look at HHS, when you look at the Department of Interior, when you look at the Department of Labor, when you look at the Department of Transportation, and when you look at US EPA, you see massive amounts of deregulation. And these are regulations of health and environmental health. When you add those numbers up together from all 3 years, again, what you see is massive deregulation. So 26 deregulatory actions for USDA compared to 3 regulations, 46 deregulatory actions for HHS compared to 18 regulations, 26 deregulatory actions for the Department of Labor compared to 2 regulatory, 50 deregulatory actions for the Department of Transportation. DOT deals with, is considered environmental because that's where we see a lot of our NEPA regulations and dealings with things that are going across our infrastructure in terms of roads and other types of things. And then 44 deregulatory efforts on the part of US EPA compared to only 10 regulatory issues. And when you look at the actual numbers in terms of what the ratios in these major agencies, what you see is just astonishing amounts of deregulations at an astonishing pace, something that we haven't seen for ever, really, not just in decades, but ever, in terms of massive amounts of changes. And it's exactly opposite of the kinds of things that you saw in terms of building regulatory infrastructure during the FDR era. What we're seeing is not building, but just tearing things down and completely removing regulation without putting anything alternative in place, just saying we're going to move back again. This is data from the New York Times, looking at it from a the actions on a content basis. So what you're seeing in the area of environmental deregulation, it's air pollution, things like pulling back climate change legislation like the Clean Power Plan. It's allowing more and more drilling, both on our public lands and in our public oceans. It's making sure that there is less infrastructure planning and evaluation of environmental protections in infrastructure. It's pulling back the Endangered Species Act and pulling away protections for water pollution, like the Waters of the United States Rule. Just massive amounts of regulatory rollbacks. The New York Times estimated as of 2019, the end of last year, there were 58 rollbacks completed environmental and 95 that were on the schedule to be going. We're currently in a process where we're moving from substantive rollback to procedural rollback in the environmental area. So CEQ just proposed its NEPA modernization rule. NEPA modernization is a rollback of NEPA from my perspective. So one of the things that it's the CEQ is saying under the National Environmental Policy Act is that we are redefining what is a major federal action so that things like federal permitting are likely not to be included in requiring an environmental impact statement. It's shortening timetables and putting a mandatory cap, absolute mandatory cap of 2 years on environmental decision-making and environmental analysis. And then after having a 2-year cap, saying that the public comment period for people to review it is only 30 days. And that if there isn't any statements in 30 days or things aren't raised substantively about the environmental impact of the project in 30 days, that there will be an estoppel, and that would be a method of precluding any kind of lawsuit moving forward. So major substantive review and major substantive procedural changes in terms of both public ability to comment and public ability to bring any kinds of lawsuits should there be concerns that NEPA is not being honored. The thing that's going on right now is EPA is proposing a strengthening transparency and regulatory science rule. That rule, the comments are due on April 17th. So if you haven't made a comment, it might be worth your considering doing so. I've included links on here to the dockets and how you can go on regulations.gov. But what this rule does, it sounds very wonderful and lawful, but what it does is that it changes the type of scientific studies that can be submitted to US EPA to consider environmental rulemaking. And basically what it says is that if all of the data presented in a study is not publicly available so that it could in theory be replicated by either industry or US EPA, then that scientific study cannot be considered. And the reason why that's important is that many of our medical studies have to have confidentiality of patients. You can't give patient names or identifying information under medical rules in order to treat patients. And so this would require that all data be available, including sensitive public, private information of folks. And it would mean that many longitudinal studies would not be available or be allowed to be considered. Basically, the US EPA has never been in the business of replicating scientific studies. They've been in the business of evaluating scientific studies, but this new rule would preclude a lot of very sound, basic peer-reviewed science from not ever being considered by the agency. So it's an important procedural change. In addition to having regulatory rollback, what we're seeing by this administration is massive funding cuts in the same agencies that are deregulating. So in addition to the laws that are on the books, there are less scientists there to evaluate applicability of what's being done, and much less people who are doing any kinds of enforcement. So it's a fundamental sea change in the way that we're doing business and the ability to look of any kind of environmental matters, including environmental justice matters. Just yesterday, the administration announced that US EPA, because of the coronavirus, has decided they are suspending indefinitely all enforcement of US environmental laws under US EPA. They're saying just civil laws, not criminal laws, but they're suspending all enforcement of all civil environmental protections during COVID things, and they didn't put an end date. It is done indefinitely, which is an enormous sea change in terms of protections. The latest data shows that US EPA, the latest CDC data shows that US life expectancy has declined over the past few years. Correlation is not causation, but we've seen an increase in US life expectancy up until we saw this massive deregulation. And now we're seeing a drop in life expectancies. Just as a point, because we are doing this remotely because of COVID-19, deaths due to influenza and pneumonia were on the increase even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And that has coincided with massive deregulation and defunding in HHS. In terms of good news, there is some. And one of the things that are doing in terms of working environmental law, Congress has what's called an Environmental Justice Initiative and an Environmental Justice Caucus that formed last year. They have been very active, both in terms of meeting, disseminating, working with the public, and also proposing laws for consideration. Among them is the Environmental Justice for All Act. One of the important things about the Environmental Justice for All Act is it's working to include things like cumulative effects in decision-making, something that the NEPA modernization is trying to reverse. And so that statute is also trying to or legislation is also proposing to codify the Clinton Environmental Justice Executive Order, something that has been on the books for a long time. Our research has consistently shown has been pretty roundly ignored by the federal government, but if it had law or teeth, that would be a way to try to work on promulgating. These other statutes and regulation, our statutes are in many ways efforts to deal with the massive deregulation. So doing things like putting protections for clean air, clean water, protecting against drilling in sensitive regions and things in place. And these are all things that are in place, being debated now, and hopefully can gain momentum as people who are concerned about environmental protections and environmental justice are willing to act. So with that, one of the things is that zip code right now is still the #1 predictor of health. It's more important in terms of predicting health than your race. It's more important to predicting health than your socioeconomic status. It's more important in predicting health than your job. Zip code is the #1 predictor in the United States of health. And that's something that we need to work on steadily because if environmental factors are one of your most important predictors, that's something that we can help work on fixing. And it starts with fixing systemic problems, and then it also means working on restoring a number of these environmental protections that are being systematically deregulated. With that, any questions I'm happy to take, and thank you very, very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much. Those were two great talks, and that was just so disturbing. I'm not sure I'll sleep at night anymore at all.
I'm sorry. I know my students say I'm a buzzkill.
Very, very illuminating. So I'm going to bring up my participant list, and if you have any questions, please use the raise your hand mechanism, and we will try to have a bit of a discussion. And if the two speakers have questions for each other, that's great too. So Elizabeth, maybe you can just tell us, aside from life expectancy going down, have you seen any other concrete evidence of the consequences of all that deregulation?
Yes, but they're more anecdotal than systematically, systematically being done. So one of the things that you're seeing, I mean, health is sort of the easiest barometer, and that's life expectancy overall. But the kinds of things that you're seeing in terms of ability to react, I mean, the best example right here, I would like to do isn't really environmental, it's just a health. And one of the first things that the Trump administration did when they came into office is that they completely abolished the pandemic response units in the White House. And one could argue that we lost a lot of time and ground in terms of dealing with this pandemic because there was literally nobody sitting in place looking at this and coming up with different types of responses or thinking about it in advance. And so in addition to having to deal with it, they had to assemble a team that otherwise would have been already in place to do it. In addition, a lot of the scientists who had been working in those units, because it had been abolished, had been fired. And so it meant going out and collecting different types of people. But that would be one of the greatest illustrations in terms of what's going on. You have lots of anecdotal types of things like that. We haven't yet had an ability to sort of study it systematically.
Okay, so Jonathan Adler has a question.
I think you're on mute.
There we go. So I guess I have two questions. The first is on environmental justice more broadly. I know originally we had Chris Timmons scheduled to be part of this panel, and he's co-authored a couple recent papers with Spencer Bonzoff and Lala Ma looking at how to disentangle correlation and causation in terms of environmental justice. And one of the things that their review of the empirical literature points to, at least as a question, is to what extent is income inequality the driver of many environmental disparities in terms of exposures and the like? And then if income inequality is, to what extent is it possible to ameliorate these things without addressing income inequality? So that was one question. The second one is related to life expectancy and deregulation. I'll confess I'm skeptical on that one for two reasons. One is, I think if one looks closely at OIRA's own assessments of how much deregulation has occurred, one gets the sense that the administration is trumpeting a lot of deregulation to its preferred constituencies, but actual on-the-ground deregulation, there hasn't been that much yet. And I think Scott Shapiro and some others have done some unpacking and how the administration has kind of exaggerated the amount of deregulation it's done. But then the other reason I guess I'm skeptical is it's in terms of the causality, in terms of how long it takes for changes in regulations to affect things like life expectancy. It seems that it would be pretty miraculous if we could see changes that quickly, particularly when there are other things out there like the opioid crisis, which at least some public health experts have pointed to as a partial driver in changes in life expectancy.
Well, the opioid crisis absolutely is, but that's also a deregulation of HHS and deregulation of services dealing with opioids and other things is one of the reasons that we're seeing, and deregulations of things in FDA is one of the reasons that we're seeing more deaths due to opioids. But can you repeat your first question? Because I wrote them down, but I got confused.
Oh, the one on environmental injustice? The
Yeah.
question is just to what, insofar as some of that, at least, some research suggests that some of that is driven by income inequality, and that can.
So you're right.
In lots of ways. So if so, to what extent can you address those inequities without addressing the underlying economic inequalities?
Well, you need to address all of the above, but here's the point that's important. When you get into people who have environmental impairments, a number of the studies are showing is that people who have environmental impairments, it's not just to them, where they're seeing in lab studies that very often exposures to things like lead have impacts, change things from a epigenetic standpoint out 4 generations. And in the public health world, we used to talk about a lot of these impoverished areas and used what they called the life course model and said it was because it's socioeconomic and folks have been downtrodden for generations, which is all true. And so that has an impact in terms of moving generations. But what you have is compounding factors. So people have environmental exposures that have epigenetic effects going out multiple generations, and then the following generations who are living in the same area also have exposures on top of it. So lead exposure on top of lead exposure on top of lead exposure, which means that people have diminished IQ, which leads to a diminished capacity to get a job, which means diminished socioeconomic status, living in worse things. It's all compounding. And so sitting here and sort of teasing out and saying, well, it's mainly socioeconomic, so we don't need to focus on the environmental, I think is a disservice to the community. The socioeconomic status is obviously an enormous problem. And if you look at COVID-19, you can see huge difference in ways of dealing it. People who are wealthier, who have flexible jobs, people who are in academia who can just move and work from home and move our classes online, have a better outcome than people who are working in minimum wage, service-related jobs that don't allow them to stay at home and have different types of protections, who may not have the security of knowing, yes, they are in fact likely to have a job as we move forward in different things. So we know that there's socioeconomic outcomes that are extraordinarily important, and clearly those need to be addressed. But that doesn't take away the enormous importance of dealing with the environmental as well.
I think to add to that, I think federally assisted housing is such a good example of how the deliberate decisions and choices that we've made, from the federal government over time, and where we're locating federally assisted housing, that becomes the cause of the harm to tenants and to residents, as opposed to the socioeconomic status, unless you're relating it to bias against low-income people and the race of people who are living in those units, and that becomes the determining factor. But in that situation where it's the actual deliberate choice on the part of housing authorities and federal agencies, as opposed to the tenant who choice has been removed, as well as their ability to participate. So and I just to emphasize and reiterate the point that Elizabeth made, that this is generational. So one generation passes that on to the next, and it really creates this burden that goes on and on for many generations to come.
Oh, I wanted to make a point in terms of the deregulation and how much there is or not, because you're right, there is a certain effort of the administration to brag more about how much is going on and what's real and what's not. And a lot of the deregulation that's taken place, the argument is that it doesn't really matter because many of these regulations were things that were promulgated in the sunsetting of the Obama administration. So a lot of the rules, like the BLM rules dealing with fracking on federal lands, and the WOTUS rule, the Waters of the United States rule, the Clean Power Plan, were things that the Obama administration put in the last 2 years in office. And when it was pulled back, there were regulations that had in fact been on the books, but had not yet been taken effect. And so a lot of people say, well, it doesn't really matter because it was a status quo type of situation. And that's true, and it's not true. We're not reducing admissions because of it, because many of those protections were never put in place. They were still being rolled out in terms of how long it takes to put them in, because environmental laws and environmental control technologies can take decades to put into effect once they've in fact been promulgated. But that's not true that they aren't real changes, because they were real changes that took an entire two-term administration to put into place, because they were so complicated and so heavily negotiated between industry and the regulated community and the public community. And they finally were going to co-infect. So the fact that those protections were rolled back is a real change. I'm not sure how measurable it is because it's keeping things status quo, but status quo isn't a good thing necessarily when we've already identified protections that need to be put in place and rolled forward.
So we have one more question from Wendy Wagner.
Hey, those were great presentations. Thanks so much. I heard a nonprofit tell me once that the federal game is over. This was like 2 years ago. And I'm just wondering, as I listen to these presentations, particularly how grounded many of these problems are, maybe what do you think about it's time to sort of give up and focus more on local and state? I mean, honestly, the virus is also showing us the power of local. So I'd just be curious what you all have to say about that.
When folks ask me what strategies, I teach health policy. And so when folks ask me what are the strategies to move things forward, I agree with it. You're not going to get much done at the federal level in certain arenas right now. A lot of it's going to be state and local, and we've seen massive amounts of progress being made at the state and local level. One of the studies we did was looking at climate regulations and what's happening, and trying to see whether climate regulations and climate protections are really being moved back or not. And what we found was that when you look at other types of things, look at alternative renewables or use terms that in fact reduce climate emissions, but don't use the term climate change, red states and blue states are actually both moving forward in terms of thinking about emissions reductions programs. They call them energy efficiency plans or renewable energy plans or things like that. They don't use the term climate change, and many of them are told if they use the term climate change, then they may be fired at the state level. But coming up with proactive state things is a very, very reasonable strategy. I think that for the interim term, in some areas, we're going to see very little efforts on the federal regulations. In other areas, we're seeing progress. So one of the other things that I do, not on the environmental side, but I do work on health transparency regulations and trying to make laws dealing with healthcare and healthcare costs more transparent. And we are seeing movement in that area with this administration who's looking at different types of things. And we're seeing, because of this pandemic, progress on things like telemedicine, which it's going to probably change the way we do business in medicine forever in terms of that, and coming up with new regulations and new ways of dealing with telemedicine and things like that. So I don't think the federal government is out of the game entirely. I think we need to be very strategic in terms of areas and movements where the federal government is in fact looking for progress. And I'm here in Washington, D.C. I meet with folks in the federal government all the time. I meet with state government people all the time. Their federal workers are there, they're open business, they are, you know, working hard in terms of doing it. It's a change in the way things are being done and need to be thought about. And we need to understand that in terms of going in. So making sure that the public health world in general, not just the environmental world, are very, very proactive in putting things in the notice and comment period, even if they're small comments, not things, saying substantive legal comments where there are problems, that this is a bad idea, is tremendously important. Changing the way we do business and not having sort of just carpet bombing agencies with a million comments that say, we think this is a bad idea as if it's a vote, is not a productive thing to be doing. That overwhelms the agency without having any kind of real meaning. It shows that there's a lot of interest, but they're better off handing a petition with a million names on it than having a million things going in where the agency has to sort through. But there is very real work to be done at the federal level. And even if you think there isn't progress, even if it's just stemming the tide and saying, taking back some of these reforms is a bad idea, that's a really, really important thing that we need to do.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We need to switch to the next panel, but this was a great session, and I think we all learned a tremendous amount. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.